From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power with David Westin.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. The big issue for the markets, for business today, is the Federal Reserve, which we'll hear from in just about exactly 2 hours from right now what their latest decision is. And then after that, we're going to hear from Jay Powell, the chair of the Fed, giving us some indication perhaps of what comes next. For a preview, we turn now to Michael Mckee. He's Bloomberg International Economics and Policy Correspondent. So, Mike, I don't mean to jump ahead, but most people think they know it's 75 basis points. What comes next?
Well, that's the real question. And as you and I were talking just before we went on the air, there is a tension between Wall Street and what's going on at the Fed. And you can sum it up by two lines on a graph. If you're listening on radio, basically the line that's going up is inflation and the line that's going down is growth. Is there a recession in the future? Does inflation start to turn around? The Fed has to figure that out. And the markets tend to think it is the growth number that's going to bother the Fed, while the Fed has been talking about inflation. So which one does Powell ratify today? Well, we'll probably get the 75 basis points one because the Fed has said it is very much concerned about inflation. But after that, what kind of guidance? I don't think you'll get a whole lot. He'll be vague. The Fed will tell you that interest rate increases are still necessary, but they'll decide as they go along, as they get more economic data, they'll be data dependent. So for those in the markets, it's going to be a question of how the Fed assesses inflation and growth. What can you read between the lines in terms of how concerned they are about it all? And of course, this is 3 days of economic festival here with numbers coming up tomorrow and Friday that are really going to matter, David. GDP, of course, that's going to be a big one for politicians, for Joe Biden. Do we get a negative print? Probably not after today's numbers. And then Friday, the PCE inflation numbers. We also get the employment cost index, what's happening with wages and salaries, and we get consumer spending. Are people still spending, and are they spending on services instead of goods? All questions that would help the Fed come to a decision today if they had that information. Unfortunately, they don't.
Well, Mike, let me just ask you one quick question here at the end. You said that Jay Powell is likely to be vague. He was not vague last time. He was quite specific. It's 50 or 75. We're looking at those numbers. Can he get away with giving less guidance this time, or will the markets read something into the very fact that he's being vague?
Well, that's an interesting question because the markets tend to look for something they can read into in the Fed statements or Jay Powell's comments. This time, I think he can probably get away with it. It was more unusual that the Fed let you know it was going to do 50 and then change their mind and let you know they were going to do 75. There's been a lot of talk from Fed officials about the idea of let's get ahead of this, we'll front load, we'll get up to neutral. Well, after today, they'll be basically at the bottom end of neutral. So they can be a little vague about what they're going to do because anything more from here should be somewhat restrictive.
Well, we'll be looking forward to the announcement, but also that news conference and your question. We always wait for that question from Michael Mckee. Thank you so much to Bloomberg's own Michael Mckee. And now we turn to the economic side of this debate, apparently, between the markets and the economists. Stephen Stanley is chief economist at Amherst Pierpont. It's a Santander company. Stephen, great to have you with us. Thank you so much. So give us your take on what kind of guidance, if any, we'll get from the chair going forward.
Oh, great to be with you today, David. So I think, as Mike said, they might like to pull back and be more vague, but it's really hard. I mean, transparency for the Fed is kind of a one-way ratchet. And once they start to provide the very specific forward guidance, it's going to be hard, I think, to take it away. So I would suspect that at least one more time they'll give us some sort of specific guidance. Maybe they'll say again, either 50 or 75. And if you look at what's priced into the Fed funds futures right now, the market is thinking it'll be somewhere between 50 and 75 in September. If he does try to go the route that Mike suggested and tries to be more vague, I suspect that Mike and his colleagues are going to pepper the chairman with questions throughout the press conference.
That sounds like fun. That sounds like something to look forward to. So, Stephen, let me ask you the question that Mike actually presaged here, which is they're making this announcement on the very eve of GDP numbers, PCE numbers, and the ECI, those employment cost index numbers. Does that make their job harder because those numbers might say something different than what they would expect?
Yeah, I think that GDP number is a particularly important one. So we got a negative GDP number in the first quarter, and there's been talk that we might get a negative one in the second quarter. I think the second quarter number will be positive, but whether it's negative or positive is huge from a psychological standpoint, because you've got a lot of folks in the market and even in the broader public who are talking about, well, if you get back-to-back negative GDP numbers, that means we're in a recession. The broader economy doesn't seem to be in a recession. Certainly labor markets are still robust, and I think while the economy is slowing down a little bit, it certainly doesn't feel like it's contracting right now. And so I think the fact that we're probably going to get a positive number in Q2 is helpful. I think it would be really difficult for the Fed if we actually were to get a negative GDP number before the meeting and then they had to deal with that, because we know that Fed officials seem to be a lot more optimistic about the economy right now than I think most market participants. Most of the Fed officials that have spoken over the last intermeeting period have been talking up the soft landing scenario as opposed to the recession narrative that dominates the markets right now.
We got some economic data, may not have been GDP or PCI. Got some economic data in today, actually, trade and also durable goods investments. Does that tend to underscore the possibility that, in fact, the economy is a bit stronger than what some people are saying?
Yeah, the trade deficit came in a lot smaller than anticipated for June, and I bumped up my Q2 GDP forecast by about 0.5% on that. So that hopefully that takes us a little further away from that magic number of 0 for tomorrow. But I think from the Fed's perspective, they're looking at things more broadly. Several of the officials have noted that maybe the GDP numbers aren't giving a completely accurate picture of the economy. They're focused also on the labor markets, and as I mentioned, I mean certainly the employment numbers, the unemployment rate continue to point to a very robust labor market. So I think right now, the economy is a bit in transition. There are sectors that are weak. I mean, housing is clearly contracting at this point, but there are other parts of the economy that are still quite strong.
And labor is one that appears to be quite strong still. Also, spending, business spending as well as consumer spending is quite strong. On the one hand, that's good news. The economy keeps going. On the other hand, does that suggest inflation is more durable than perhaps we thought, and therefore the Fed might have to go farther to get it under control?
Right. Well, that's my baseline view. I think the economy is going to continue to grow in the second half of the year. And inflation looks to me to be pretty stubbornly high at this point. If you look at the last few CPI releases, what's most troubling is that the areas that are accelerating are ones that tend to be the most persistent. Shelter costs and a lot of the service categories. So this isn't, last year we were seeing a lot of volatility in airfares and hotel rates and used car prices and things like that we knew were kind of a high amount of noise. Now what we're seeing is that inflation has broadened out. It's pretty pervasive at this point. And even in the corporate earnings numbers that we've been getting over the last week or two, a lot of companies talking about raising their prices and likely continuing to raise their prices. So yeah, I think in my view, inflation is going to remain stubbornly high for a while. Certainly into next year. And as a result, I think the Fed's going to have to keep going.
Well, okay, keep going. That's my question. Keep going how far? I mean, what do you project? Where are they at the end of the year? How far up do they go before they at least flatten out?
So I have the funds rate getting to 3 7/8 by the end of the year, and then peaking out at 4 5/8 around the middle of next year. So that puts me about 100 basis points higher than what's priced into the market right now for the peak.
But that would certainly suggest they're not going to be coming back down again until sometime maybe in the second half of next year or even later than that.
Yeah, exactly. And I would say, I mean, I do think that those level of that level of rates probably will push the economy into recession. So I do think we are going to eventually get an economic downturn. I just think that it comes later and at a higher level of rates than what the market is currently pricing in.
One last one here, Stephen, which is about that employment cost index, ECI. I believe it's true. You would know that the Fed pays a fair amount of attention to that. And we've had people like Larry Summers say to me, he really focuses on that because that might indicate whether, in fact, we're getting a wage price spiral. Do you agree with that?
I think that's critical. I talked a little bit about the persistence of inflation and looking at some of the key components within the inflation indices. And that's part of what we're seeing right now is that it looks like companies are having to raise wages to bring in workers. We know that the labor market has been very tight for a while now, and that is feeding through to prices. And wage price spiral is a term that was popularized in the 70s, and spiral might be a little of an exaggeration of what we're saying right now, but I do think it's something that we really need to focus on. And I do think that a tight labor market is likely to sustain inflation pressures for a while longer.
Okay, Stephen, always wonderful to have you with us. That's Stephen Stanley of Amherst Pierpont. That's a Santander company. And be sure to watch our special coverage of the Fed decision today, starting at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Coming up here, monkeypox is here, and COVID hasn't left yet. We talk with Dr. Laura Forman of Kent Hospital. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. We want to keep you up to date with news from all around the world. For that, we turn to Mark Crumpton here with the first word. Mark?
David, thank you. President Biden has tested negative for COVID-19 and has ended his isolation. The president, speaking from the Rose Garden just moments ago, said COVID-19 isn't gone, but that Americans can avoid serious illness with vaccines and treatments. Mr. Biden, who is 79 years old, went positive for COVID-19 last week. And President Biden is set to speak with China's President Xi Jinping on Thursday. The call will take place at a difficult juncture for U.S.-China relations. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's staff has not ruled out that she will visit Taiwan next month. China has warned against the trip. Beijing considers Taiwan part of its territory. Bloomberg has learned that the Justice Department is using a grand jury to investigate efforts by former President Trump and his aides to overturn the election. The focus is on creating fake electors and pressuring former Vice President Mike Pence to refuse to certify the Biden victory. No comment yet from the Trump camp. A strong earthquake triggered landslides and damaged buildings in the northern Philippines today. At least 5 people are said to have been killed and dozens of others injured. It's been reported as a 7-magnitude quake. A safety officer in a town near the earthquake's epicenter said, quote, "The ground shook like I was on a swing." Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. I want to come back to that story that Mark just covered, which the President Biden appearing in the Rose Garden a short time ago, because he has now recovered from COVID. But some of the things he said about it, I want to quote one thing in particular. He said, the President, BA5 means many of us are still going to get COVID, even if we take precautions. That doesn't mean we're doing anything wrong. To take us through exactly what we know about COVID and its after effects, we welcome back now Dr. Laura Forman. She's Kent Hospital Chief of Emergency Medicine. Doctor, thank you so much for being back with us. And you have to pay attention to the President of the United States. He's just had it. He says, you're not doing anything wrong. You're still going to get it. How many times are we going to get it? Is there anything we can do about it?
So it is really preventable. You just have to be incredibly careful and incredibly diligent in that care. Wearing a mask is very, very effective in preventing this, and being careful in terms of who you're around and distancing when you need to is also incredibly helpful as well. So, there's some new evidence out that shows that people are getting second infections. I've had patients who are getting third, fourth infections now. There was a research study that was recently published that showed that with recurrent infections, you run a much higher risk of having some long COVID issues in terms of heart damage and lung damage done. We have this perception in society that you get COVID multiple times And, you're probably going to have a milder infection every time you go around, that it'll be like the flu or chickenpox. But unfortunately, it's really not so. So here in the ER, we're seeing people with more severe infections, sometimes with a recurrent infection. So yes, it's still out there. Yes, we're definitely seeing an uptick in cases, but it is really preventable.
Are your cases there in the ER at Kent, are they going up?
Absolutely. Yeah, I walked in yesterday morning and I asked one of my colleagues, how's it going? And she just shook her head and she said, it's all COVID, all over the place, all over again. We're certainly seeing an uptick. We're seeing an uptick in mild and moderate cases. We've had some severe cases. Thankfully, the death rates are not going up at the same rate. That having been said, it's still a pretty significant death rate. Yesterday in this country, more people died of COVID than statistically died of stroke. So, we've kind of gotten used to these death counts, but it's still unacceptably high for such a transmissible disease. But the good news is there's something you can do about it. You can wear a mask, protect yourself, and protect other people.
Why don't we require everybody to wear masks at this point? Is it politics or is it medicine?
Boy, if I can answer that question, it's definitely not medicine. We're requiring everybody in the staff, patients, visitors, and staff, everybody in the hospital, rather, to be wearing a mask right now. It's annoying to have to wear one, but I got to say, of all the things we do to protect our health, it's way easier than going on a diet and exercising. So it's certainly not medicine. Medicine we're big believers in the mask. It's kept most of us safe as long as we're wearing it properly throughout this. So I do think it's, I don't know if it's politics. Yeah, I am hearing a lot of people say that they're over the pandemic, which, believe me, I'm over it too. I love it to be gone as much as anybody else, but it's kind of like saying, I'm over the pandemic and I'm not going to wear a mask is a little bit like saying I'm over the rain and so I'm going to go outside without an umbrella and expect not to get wet. The pandemic's not over us. It's still got a ways to go to run its course. And so I think it's important that we stay careful about this stuff, both to protect ourselves. Like I said, you're at risk, higher risk, the more you get infected with some long-term consequences, and to protect other people. You choose not to wear a mask, you take a plane ride someplace, the next day you're in a grocery store, you don't even know you have COVID yet, that you got on the airplane, and you're standing behind someone's grandmother, and 4 days later she's in the ICU and you're the person that gave it to her. So, we're doing this to protect people among us who are really vulnerable to it, and to protect ourselves. And then we're also doing it because every chance we give this virus to mutate, it's going to do that. Every person who gets this gives the virus more of a chance to grow and mutate. And we've seen what it does when it mutates. It becomes more and more contagious.
So, Doctor, COVID isn't over us, but we have a new bug in town, that's monkeypox now. And I guess one of my questions is, how big a problem is this? And by the way, we have a vaccine. Why aren't we just vaccinating everyone for monkeypox the way we do for COVID now?
These are both really good questions. So we're certainly starting to see an uptick in these cases as well. But I think, honestly, we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg. We don't have rapid tests for this yet, and we can't really adequately contact trace because we don't get the test back in a reasonable time frame. So I think we're seeing some cases, but I think there are far more cases out there, just like there were with COVID early on, than we're actually seeing. So it's going to become much more of a problem. I think as a nation, we've been really focused on preventing COVID. And so this kind of snuck up on us. We've been behind the 8 ball when it comes to testing, when it comes to contact tracing, when it comes to the vaccine. A lot of the vaccines that we had were stored overseas, and we also didn't have a huge storage of them. And so it's been a pretty slow rollout. I would love to have everybody vaccinated at this point, but right now, most of the effort's been focused on folks who are at a higher risk for it. That having been said, I worry because, yes, we're talking a lot about men who have sex with men being at higher risk for this disease, and that's certainly the case. But the thing with viruses is that they really don't care who you're sleeping with.
Just one more question on monkeypox, if I could. We were talking about really populations at risk, and we talked about men having sex with men, but also I read that pregnant women and children are particularly vulnerable as well. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct. And that's why I was saying there are more people who are vulnerable than we're thinking about, and it can be spread relatively easily. It's spread different than COVID, but this is something that can live on surfaces for a while. It is spread with contact. There is some way to spread it with respiratory droplets as well. So, I got to say, this is not the time when I would want to be stuck in a crowd full of people.
Okay, Doctor, I really appreciate you coming in. And again, thanks for your patience with our technical problems. This
Thank
is Dr.
you.
Laura Forman. She is Kent Hospital Chief of Emergency Medicine. And now I want to check on the markets as we all are in anticipation of that Fed decision coming out short time from now. And for a review of the markets, we turn now to Kriti Gupta. So, Kriti, the Fed is going to be taking a look at a lot of things, including consumer numbers, I suspect.
A lot of consumer numbers. What's interesting, though, is that the market is kind of following the pattern that's pretty normal for Fed days. Essentially, the market is roaring higher. Now, a lot of this does have to to do with the earnings picture. You can see that NASDAQ outperformance is crucial with Alphabet and Microsoft reporting after the bell. Texas Instruments as well. The idea here being that if tech can survive this kind of macro headwind recessionary environment, then perhaps every other company in the S&P 500 can as well. So it is that optimism baked into it, but also the pattern shows, at least lately, that the pricing in ahead of the Federal Reserve does actually mean a higher stock market. So that is going to be crucial as we talk about that. But tech outperformance is key. I'd say that the consumer story is key too, though, David, because we talk a lot about how tech is this kind of macro bellwether, but take a look at like names, say, like Chipotle, for example, Hilton Hotels, Boeing even, all of which are increasing their outlooks. Chipotle specifically saying that their consumers are still buying their products even with those price hikes. It speaks to the stability that you are seeing in a lot of the restaurant industry. McDonald's said the same thing. Coca-Cola, very similar as well. So as we talk about the worries here that ultimately the consumer is dealing with a lot of inflation, sentiment is low, but at the end of the day, David, they are still spending.
So, Crete, tell me whether this is too big a reach. You've just talked about consumers at places like Chipotle, McDonald's, places like that. At the same time, one of the concerns was advertising over on the tech side. And I wonder if we got some numbers that suggest that maybe Snap didn't indicate advertising is all going away right away.
Well, there's a nuance here, and I think this is where Alphabet really comes in handy. And Meta after the bell, or otherwise known as Facebook after the bell, will also come in handy. And the idea here is that there's ad spend and then there's search revenue. And that's really where Alphabet and through Google, it really works. Because if you look at the YouTube ad revenue year over year, the numbers look pretty decent, up about almost 5%. But for Google search revenue, overall, it's about 12%. So once again, it is that ad revenue that is underperforming, and you are seeing a deceleration. It's not an outright drop or a contraction by any means, but the idea here is that people are doing more search revenue, so the consumer is once again in control, but the ad revenue, which is really driven by businesses wanting to advertise, that's where you perhaps see a little bit of a slowdown, and that makes sense as businesses say, we need to cut costs. How do we do it?
Well, and as we said, the Fed is going to take this all into account, presumably, as they make their decision, but as important to indicate where they're going next. But I wonder what the markets are telling us right now, and the bond market in particular. As I'm looking at the 10-year yield now, it's back down under 2.8%. That doesn't suggest to me they think there's going to be an awful lot more hiking going on.
It doesn't, but you know what? I would look at the 2s-10s curve instead, the classic kind of proxy for any recession calls, the idea that if the 2s-10s remains inverted for a very long time, that's where you're going to start to see pain and perhaps an early signal of recession. Right now, David, the 2s-10s curve is a negative 31 basis points. In previous recessions, it's been 40 or 50 basis points. In the recession of the 70s, it was as down as much as 200 basis points. Now we're getting closer and closer to that 40 and 50. So there are some people out there who are saying that recession signal, it is flashing bright red.
Yeah, they may also be assuming if we get a recession, the Fed will back off, and it depends on what happens with inflation. Some people think that won't happen. Thank you so much to Kriti Gupta. You can catch Kriti again at 1 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Markets, where she will be anchoring. Coming up, Democratic Senator from Michigan, Gary Peters, on the CHIPS Act, and what else the Senate can get done before it leaves town. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Well, maybe getting into the dog days of summer, but the Senate is hard at work in Washington, D.C. right now with the CHIPS Act supposedly to be voted on today, as well as some other things on its agenda. To take us through all that, we welcome now Democratic Senator from Michigan, Gary Peters. So, Senator, thanks so much for taking time out. Let's start with the CHIPS Act. Where is it? I thought there was going to be a vote today. Is there going to be one?
There will be. Actually, it may have started as I'm standing here. It's coming up momentarily, and we're expecting it to pass by a large margin. We've already had the procedural votes to show we've got over 60 votes. We expect that'll occur in probably within the next half hour.
Are there other things you think you can get done before you go into recess in August?
Well, what I think is absolutely essential that we get done is to move a package to lower drug prices. We hope to get that done next week through what's called a reconciliation process, but that will allow Medicare, for example, to negotiate with pharmaceutical companies for prices, which will bring down the cost for consumers. Also, we'll shore up some of the funding for the Affordable Care Act to make sure that people don't see increases in their health insurance premiums into the next year, particularly given the inflation that we're seeing. Any way that we can help bring down costs, whether that be prescription drugs or the insurance costs that they're paying will be certainly very welcome and really, quite frankly, quite necessary for families.
So, Senator, in addition to all that, you are the chair of the Homeland Security Committee of the Senate. And one of the things we learned on the House side for the January 6th, the Select Committee, was that there apparently are texts from the Secret Service during the critical periods that no longer exist. You've been outspoken on that. What do you know about what's going on there?
Well, we're still asking lots of questions that have to be asked. We're trying to get information. We're trying to see if we can recover some of those texts. To me, it's kind of unfathomable that the Secret Service would erase these texts, particularly when we learned last week in the January 6th Commission that they were contacting their families. The crew that was protecting Vice President Pence were actually contacting their families and saying goodbye. They thought the situation was going to get very ugly and that their lives were in danger. Clearly, there was a lot of communication going on within the Secret Service, and to have all those texts wiped out, and they were wiped out even after there was a request for the Secret Service to preserve documents related to January 6th. But I would think you wouldn't need a request to preserve documents when you're in the middle of a riotous attack on the Capitol, insurrection. You would think the Secret Service would know better and not erase it. So it certainly is very suspicious behavior. Questions have to be asked, and we need to find some answers, and we're in the process of aggressively pursuing that.
And Senator, from your point of view, who should take the lead in asking those questions? Is it your Homeland Security Committee? Is it the FBI? Is it the Inspector General? Who should be taking the lead?
Well, certainly Inspector General has already been looking at it. They need to continue to do that. But as I chair Homeland Security and Government Affairs, we are the top oversight committee in the United States Senate. So clearly within our jurisdiction, we're going to certainly play our part, but others will do that as well.
Give us timing on that, Senator. When do you expect? Would you have oversight hearings, would you expect?
It's possible. We're still evaluating the evidence. We're still asking questions. We're still waiting for responses. But clearly, it's something that is very, very possible.
And as far as you know, is the Justice Department involved as yet?
I believe so, but I don't know the extent of it.
Okay, thanks so much. In addition to all of that, you've got an awful lot on your plate. You're also the chair of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee. We do have midterms coming up. You may have heard something about that. You may actually even be involved in one of them. So give us a sense from the Democrats' point of view. That's generally thought in the world out here that it's sort of 50-50 on whether you can keep your 50-member or majority position in the Senate. How do you see it?
Yeah, I think it's definitely competitive. These races are going to be competitive. My focus is particularly on 4 incumbents that have very tough states. I'm working to make sure they all come back, and when they do come back, we will continue to have the majority. But I also think we can go on the offense. There are a number of states that are very competitive. And the thing that we look at is if you look at our incumbents and our challengers, or our candidates rather, there is a clear contrast between the candidates that the Republican Party has been putting up. You know, I just have to talk about Georgia. We have Raphael Warnock, an outstanding senator, doing a great job in Georgia. And we see Herschel Walker, the Republican nominee there, stumbling continuously. Clearly a weak candidate, not ready for prime time. And then we see that in places like Pennsylvania, which is a pickup opportunity for us, where the Republican candidate, Dr. Oz, also is showing very weak performance. So I'm very optimistic. We're going to work very hard in the coming months. It's getting close, but I'm very optimistic that we will not only hold our majority, we may pick up a couple seats.
So Senator, as you say, it's the strength of the candidate, it's the strength of the positions on the issues, it's also money. As I understand the way politics works, that counts too. Where are you going to be putting most of your money? And by the way, how much of a war chest do you have?
Yeah, certainly resources are important. You know, each of our individual candidates are outraising their opponents by significant amounts, so the candidates themselves are doing well. At the DSCC, the organization that I chair, we're raising record amounts, so we're above where we were 2 years ago in that cycle. So I'm confident we will have all the resources that we need to get our message out. And given the very clear contrast between Democratic candidates and incumbents and their challengers, I'm confident we're going to have a good fall. Even though this is a tough environment, it comes down to candidate quality, and we have far superior candidates on the ballot.
Senator, I noticed you mentioned Georgia, you mentioned Pennsylvania. What about Wisconsin? Because I've read some about Wisconsin. Of course, there's a challenger out there, actually, who's named Lasry, a name that we know here at Bloomberg, and you know as well, given your background in finance. So what about Wisconsin? Is there a possibility for pickup there?
Yes, absolutely. There's no question. The incumbent there, Ron Johnson, is polling very low. It does not have the strength in that state that an incumbent should have. We have a primary, although you mentioned Mr. Lasry. He just pulled out of the race just moments ago. And so that race is starting to firm up in terms of the primary. The primary is a week and a half away. We will have our candidate at that time. And I'm confident whoever our nominee ends up being, they're going to run a very strong race, and we have a great opportunity to pick up a seat in Wisconsin, a state that did vote for Joe Biden in 2020, and a state that we feel very comfortable in.
I must say, Senator, we love a guest that comes on and breaks news like Mr. Lasry pulling out, because I'll confess I did not know that. It must have just happened. Thank you so much.
Just happened. It did.
It's so great to have you with us. That is Gary Peters. He's Democratic Senator from Michigan and chair of the Homeland Security Committee in the Senate. Coming up, we're going to go to the other side of the aisle and talk with Republican Senator Thom Tillis of North Carolina. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Westin. We want to keep you up to date with news from all around the world. For that, we turn to Mark Crumpton here with the first word.
David, thank you. President Biden has tested negative for COVID-19 and has ended his isolation. The president, speaking from the Rose Garden less than an hour ago, said COVID-19 isn't gone, but that Americans can fight it.
BA5 means many of us are still going to get COVID, even if we take the precautions. That doesn't mean we're doing anything wrong. Unfortunately, this COVID is still with us, as it has been for 2.5 years. But our fight against COVID is making a huge difference.
President Biden, who is 79 years old, tested positive for COVID-19 last week. The Pentagon is making contingency plans if House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visits Taiwan. Officials say the U.S. military would increase its presence in the Indo-Pacific. They say they have little fear that China would attack Speaker Pelosi's plane if she flies to Taiwan, but the speaker would be entering a hot spot. China considers Taiwan its own territory. In Europe, natural gas prices soared again after Russia tightened its grip on the region's energy supply. Benchmark natural gas surged as much as 14%. Supplies through the biggest gas link from Russia to the EU fell to just 20% of capacity today. Gazprom says it's a maintenance issue. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, we all are waiting for the federal rate decision coming out in about an hour and 18 minutes from right now. And we turn now to somebody who's a member of the Senate Banking Committee for some of his thoughts on what we might expect of the Federal Reserve. He's Republican Senator from North Carolina, Thom Tillis. So, Senator, thank you so much for being with us. What do you expect? What would you like the Fed to do?
Well, David, I think we've still got to use every device that the Fed has to try and combat the headwinds that are leading into a recession. And I believe that this is one tool that they have to use. We'll see today whether or not it's 75 basis points or a percentage point, but it is something with their dual mandate that they have to focus on, and I'll respect their decision. But we also have to understand that we're in very, very difficult times right now with 40-year highs for inflation. Gas prices are through the roof. We've got to do something, and the Fed has a role to play in that.
So take us back to the Senate, because I know you're busy right through July here, and particularly what the Senate is doing. Today, I believe we're likely to get a vote on the so-called CHIPS bill to invest some of the $52 billion in chips manufacturing. How does that fit into the economic package as you see it?
Well, I think it's critically important. If you talk to semiconductor manufacturers, they say that to set up a plant in the United States is as much as 3 times more expensive than other jurisdictions, including China, where a $100 billion investment could be a $25 billion investment. Those are real numbers. We have to do something to make sure that we make our supply chains more resilient, make ourselves less dependent on China and other areas that could be at risk for disrupting supply chains. And it would have dramatic, every phone, every car, virtually every device you buy today is reliant on these chip capabilities that we simply have very limited or no capacity here in the United States.
How does it fit into the inflation picture? Does it help, hurt, or is it indifferent to it? As you say, this is a supply chain issue. It's critical for us. But how does it fit into the economy?
Well, some people have asked me how I could support spending here when I've opposed spending in other areas. First off, this is long term. Secondly, this drives economic development. It's not unlike the bipartisan infrastructure bill last year, where we averted the spending of almost $3.5 trillion that would have absolutely accelerated the challenges that we're already seeing with inflation. These are longer-term investments that are going to grow jobs and grow a very strategic capability in the United States. And I believe that most members understand that. What the public doesn't see is what we see in classified briefings and how we're at risk if we don't take these steps.
Senator, give us a sense of what, if anything else, the Senate might be able to get done before it goes into recess.
Well, I, for one, hope that we get the treaty ratified to recognize Finland and Sweden accession into NATO. These are incredible additions to NATO. They will be a net exporter of security on day one. They already work very closely. I serve as the co-lead of the Senate NATO Observer Group. I've been to Sweden recently. I was at the Madrid summit. And I think there's growing support for it. I believe it sends a big signal to other members who have not yet ratified it for the United States to be one of the first to do so. Historically, we're not, but we understand that this is important. And as quickly as we can get Finland, in particular, with 830 miles of shared border with Russia, the better.
Is there any opposition? Is there any resistance that you can identify?
No, David, I think it comes down to some technical objections, the procedures that we'll go through next week. But I just spoke with some of the floor managers, and we feel confident that we'll be able to get it done before we move into August recess.
What about other legislation that might affect the cost to consumers in this inflationary environment? As you know, we just talked with your colleague from the other side of the aisle, Gary Peters of Michigan, and he said one of the things that can be done for the American consumer is to really allow the government to negotiate over the prescription drugs to get the price down. Is that a good idea?
Well, I think that it's always a good idea to lower prescription drug prices, but the way they're going about it is going to fail. And this is what the American people need to understand. This will not get a single Republican vote. It will be done through a vehicle they called reconciliation that's related to the budget. They're going to take billions of dollars to subsidize an unsustainable marketplace that came out under the Affordable Care Act. So the money is coming out of Medicare. It would seem to me that minimally, whatever money you take out of the pharmaceuticals industry should go back into making Medicare solvent. We've got work to do there, and this is a bad policy at the wrong time. It will increase spending. This is going directly, without any income caps, to people who are on the exchange buying insurance policies that the Obama administration promised were going to be sustainable. And this is extending subsidies that they've already passed in the $1.9 trillion package last year without a single Republican vote that is absolutely a contributor to the economic hardships that we're having right now.
So, Senator, take me through this. Go back in history now. You'll remember this better than I do. My recollection is that when we first had these prescription drugs put under Medicare, it was actually under George W. Bush when he was president, and they did that specifically banning a negotiation of lower prices, which was pretty extraordinary because normally when you're that big a buyer, you'd negotiate a better price. Am I getting that wrong?
Well, I think we always have to look at ways to negotiate a better price. But there was just a report out, I think it was from the University of Chicago. We have to get it right. And to get it right, you have to have pharmaceutical companies, prescription benefit managers, everybody in the room trying to figure out how we can sustain what has been about a 10-year trend of prices going down. But if we get this wrong, we're going to see almost 18% less R&D investment. This is the same industry that created a vaccine in record time. You're going to see, it's estimated through the same study, 135 drugs that would otherwise go to market and save people's lives or provide them with therapy are simply not going to be, they're not going to be available. So that's why I'm saying this, it feels to me like more of a political gimmick and giving life to the exchange, the Affordable Care Act, the so-called Obamacare exchanges, than actually fixing what they say they're fixing with prescription drugs. And I believe that after they pass it, we're going to have to come back in Congress and do a better job, one that's sustainable.
Senator, one more on the agenda of the Senate. There is a bill pending that you know well. They say it's to provide for same-sex marriage. It's actually, I think, to repeal the Defense of Marriage Act, which goes back to the Clinton era. And you've come out and said, as I understand it, you're in favor of it. Why is it important for Congress to do that now?
Well, the law is settled. I don't think that it's absolutely necessary, but it is before us. And I think that we should vote our consciences. But at the end of the day, it doesn't change anything. It codifies a Supreme Court decision. And that's a role that the Article I branch can have. I don't think it's I don't necessarily think it's the best use of our time right now if you think of other matters like the economy. But it is before us, and I support it.
Okay, Senator, always appreciate your spending time with us. Thank you so much. That's Republican Senator from North Carolina, Thom Tillis. Coming up, President Biden is preparing for a call with China's Xi Jinping. More on that next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Well, we learned today that President Biden has scheduled now a call with President Xi Jinping of China for tomorrow. To give us a preview of what we might expect from that call, we welcome now Bloomberg Washington correspondent Anne-Marie Hordern from the White House. So, Anne-Marie, what do we expect from this call? It's a long time coming.
Yeah, it is. The last time they spoke, of course, was in March, and now there's these fresh tensions brewing between Washington and Beijing about Taiwan, specifically about whether or not Speaker Pelosi is going to visit Taiwan. The president said that now would not be a good time in terms of what the military was advising. We do have reporting from our Billy House over at Congress, a scoop that on her official schedule right now, it's Japan and it's Singapore and Indonesia, potentially a stop in Malaysia. But so far, Taiwan is not on this official schedule. What we have heard from China, though, David, is that if she was to come, they are really preparing and they are vehemently against this visit. So as this call takes place between the president and between Xi Jinping, this is certainly going to be one of the areas potentially China will bring up, Taiwan. And then, of course, the other is tariffs. For months, the administration has been debating whether or not they're going to lift those tariffs. Is something Xi Jinping wants to see.
Well, I'm glad you raised the tariffs because, as you say, for months we've been hearing maybe it's going to happen, maybe it's not going to happen, maybe it's big, maybe it's little. Where does it stand, and what happens when President Xi asks President Biden directly, if he does, what about the tariffs?
It's a great question. I have no new news on that front. It is still a debate, it seems, within the administration. Ultimately, the president will have to make this decision. But there's really different factors that are playing into this. Of course, you have the trade representative saying that's going to lose some leverage. Then you have the economics team, which is saying if we're going to use any tool in our toolbox to fight inflation, this could potentially be one. Lift some of these tariffs from the Trump era on some of these consumer goods coming into the United States from China. And then, of course, David, there's a third factor of this, and that's the fact that labor unions don't want to see tariffs lifted on Chinese goods. And we know that this president always wants to talk about union jobs, and he wants to talk to the labor unions. So he's really in a pickle deciding whether or not if he is going to do this. But they've been debating it for months. China desperately wants to see some action on it. And we're just not sure yet. We're not even sure if this is going to come up in the call. But from the Chinese stance, it would be likely this is something they would bring up.
But I have to say, Anne-Marie, listening to you, that's one big difference between the systems, right? I don't hear much debate going on with the Chinese system about how they handle the United States. Does that put the United States and President Biden at something of a disadvantage that there is this debate going on?
Well, we don't really talk about the debates within China right now. But I think, David, even the fact that China at the moment is really having some fiery rhetoric when it comes to a potential trip by Speaker Pelosi to Taiwan potentially could show the Chinese Communist Party really deflecting and Xi Jinping deflecting for what is going on at home. Just today, the first headline I saw when I woke up is a district outside of Wuhan shutting down. 1 million people. It is back to March 2020. China has a zero COVID policy, and there is a lot of resentment there.
So they have their own challenges. Thank you so much to Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the Terminal and online. And as we leave you on television right now, they're voting on the CHIPS bill in the Senate. And this is Bloomberg.